A lone winter wind sweeps through the frozen palaces of St. Petersburg. Chandeliers hang in silence, their crystals catching the last flicker of twilight. Footsteps echo down marble corridors, distant, hesitant like ghosts retracing their steps through time. Beyond the gilded doors lies a room once filled with laughter, now shrouded in dust. The portraits of emperors and empresses gaze out from cracked frames, their painted eyes holding secrets of blood, love, and downfall. This was the House of Romanov, the dynasty that ruled an empire with divine conviction and lost it with human fragility. In the hush before the storm of revolution, the empire of splendor and shadows awaited its reckoning. If history still haunts your heart, stay with us and step into the twilight of the Romanovs. The boy who became an empire. The wind that swept through Moscow in the winter of 1613 was unlike any other. It carried not just snow, but the scent of smoke, fear, and exhausted prayers. The time of troubles, a decade of famine, war, and pretenders, had hollowed the Russian land. Entire villages had vanished into the frozen earth. The great bells of Moscow tolled for a people too weary to listen. Across the river, the Kremlin's dome stood blackened with soot, their crosses bent from the weight of fire and despair. Inside the fortress, the boy waited. His name was Mikhail Romanov, 16 years old, thin, uncertain, his hands trembling as priests murmured blessings he barely understood. He had not sought the crown. It had been thrust upon him like a burden carved from ice. His mother, the nun Martha, wept silently behind her veil. When the boy turned to her, she whispered, "This is not a gift, Misha. It is a cross." The council outside, the Zemsky Sober, had chosen him not for his strength, but for his name. The Romanovs were distantly related to the old rulers, the Ruriks, and after years of blood and impostors, the people craved legitimacy more than power. Mikhail's father, once imprisoned by Polish invaders, now prayed in exile. When the messengers arrived to tell him his son had been made Tsar, he is said to have fallen to his knees and whispered, "God forgive them. They make a child bear the sins of a nation." On a gray morning in July, beneath the gilded domes of the Dormition Cathedral, Mikhail Romanov was crowned Tsar of all Russia. The air shimmered with incense. The patriarch placed the monomax cap, heavy with fur and jewels, upon the boy's head. Witnesses said his lips moved silently, as though repeating a prayer only he could hear. Outside, the cannons roared. Bells pealed across the city, echoing through ruins and ashes, proclaiming that Russia had a ruler once more. But what does it mean for a boy to inherit a broken world? In the months that followed, Mikhail's court became a place of quiet rebuilding. Messengers rode out into the desolate countryside, bearing decrees of pardon and peace. Grain was gathered from what little remained. The young Tsar listened more than he spoke, his pale face unreadable, his eyes haunted by the ghosts of what had been lost. Foreign ambassadors described him as shy, devout, but with a strange endurance, like a candle that will not go out, though the wind blows from every side. The people, too, began to believe again. They rebuilt their homes, their churches. The Romanov name became a promise of order, of faith, of a future that would not collapse into chaos. Yet even as Mikhail prayed for peace, the empire's old enemies circled like wolves. Poland still held Smolensk, Sweden, the northern lands. Every border was a wound. In the cold of one December night, Mikhail walked the ramparts of the Kremlin. Snowflakes clung to his robe. Below him, Moscow slept, a city scarred yet alive. "If I am to rule," he murmured to the priest beside him, "then I must learn not only to pray for Russia, but to suffer for her." The priest nodded. "That is the duty of all kings, but only a few ever understand it." Far to the east, across endless forests and rivers, men began to speak his name again with hope. Russia was no longer dying. It was awakening. The boy who had never sought a crown now bore the weight of centuries, a seed of fire and ice, destined to grow into an empire that would one day stretch across the world. And in that quiet, frozen dawn, the first Romanov looked toward eternity, not knowing the light he carried would one day end in blood. The faith of a fragile throne. The candlelight of the early Romanov court flickered against the cold stone walls, shadows stretching long, like memories refusing to fade. Mikhail Romanov, though crowned by divine right, ruled an empire more illusion than reality. Every decision, every decree, was weighed against the fragile thread that held Russia together. The people believed the Tsar's power came from God, but Mikhail knew better. Power was not given, it was endured. His mother, the nun Martha, remained his closest counsel. She moved through the palace like a specter of conscience, reminding him that the splendor of kingship was merely the burden of stewardship. "You must forgive," she told him often. "You must rebuild, or the blood on the snow will never dry." From his chambers, the Tsar could hear the murmurs of the city, merchants haggling, priests chanting, the laughter of children returning to streets once emptied by plague and war. Hope was fragile, yet it pulsed again in the veins of the nation. The Romanovs, a family of survivors, had become the vessel of that hope. Still, Mikhail's Russia was not a land at peace. It was a land on the edge of exhaustion. The scars of civil war remained raw. Cossack uprisings in the south, Swedish garrisons in the north, every border groaned under the weight of enemies. The treasury was empty, famine stalked the countryside. In letters preserved from the time, one noble wrote, "We have chosen a boy to rule us, and now we must pray he grows faster than the winter." He did grow. The boy became a man of patience and quiet will. His reign was one of survival, not conquest, a lesson the empire would soon forget. He surrounded himself with advisors loyal not to ambition but to restoration. Roads were repaired, trade reopened, treaties signed. Slowly, painfully, Russia began to breathe again. The symbol of that rebirth was faith. Mikhail rebuilt cathedrals and monasteries burned by war. Across the land, icons once hidden from marauders were returned to altars. Pilgrims walked barefoot for miles to thank God for the Tsar's mercy. The bells of Moscow tolled again, not for the dead, but for the living. And yet beneath the hymns, another sound stirred the whisper of destiny. In 1645, as Mikhail's strength waned, his son Alexei ascended beside him, the second Romanov, young and ambitious. When Mikhail died that July, the funeral bells of the Kremlin rang for 3 days. Peasants wept openly in the streets, though few had ever seen his face. His was not a reign of glory but of survival, and in survival, Russia had found its foundation. Alexei inherited more than a throne. He inherited a dream barely formed, a vision of Russia not as a broken land but as a chosen one. Under his rule, the empire began to transform. Wooden churches gave way to white stone cathedrals, their domes gleaming in the northern sun. Scholars translated foreign books into Russian. Nobles sent their sons abroad to learn the ways of Europe. The world was changing, and for the first time, Russia dared to look beyond its own walls. But progress was never free. Behind every reform stood sacrifice. Alexei's reign, though pious, was marked by the tightening of serfdom, peasants bound to the land like shadows to the soil. Freedom for the few meant chains for the many. In the shimmering halls of Moscow, the nobility grew rich. In the villages, hunger became a silent prayer. Still, the people believed. They called their ruler the quietest Tsar for his gentleness and his devotion. He prayed not for conquest but for harmony, though history rarely allows such mercy. For in the distant horizon, storms gathered once more. A child was born in 1672, Alexei's son, Peter. Unlike his father or grandfather, this boy would not be content to preserve. He would ignite. And with his birth, the House of Romanov began to trade its innocence for ambition. The rise of the Firebearer. The winter of 1672 had been harsh, even by Russian standards. The Neva River froze so thick that wagons crossed it like roads of glass, and wolves prowled the edges of villages, their cries mixing with the wind. But inside the royal chambers of the Kremlin, a child's cry pierced the cold. Peter Alexeyevich Romanov, the future Peter the Great, was born beneath the trembling light of a single candle. No one yet knew that with this child, Russia's fate would split forever. between the sacred and the modern, the holy and the human. His father, Tsar Alexei, died when Peter was barely 3. Power slipped into the hands of regents, courtiers, and his half-sister Sophia, a woman of sharp intellect and ruthless resolve. Moscow became a theater of intrigue. Behind the veiled windows of the Kremlin, whispers turned to plots and plots to blood. The Streltsy, elite musketeers of the royal guard, rose in rebellion, their fury painted across the cobblestones in crimson streaks. Peter, still a boy, was hidden by loyal servants in the monastery of the Miracle. There he learned early what all rulers must: that trust is the most dangerous gift of all. The echoes of screams haunted his nights. The Streltsy revolt, he would later say, burned fear from my heart forever. From that crucible of terror emerged something different: curiosity. Unlike his predecessors, Peter's mind did not rest in prayer or tradition. It hungered for motion, for the workings of ships, the gears of clocks, the anatomy of the world. He spent hours disassembling muskets, building miniature fortresses, sailing toy boats in palace ponds. His tutors despaired. His mother prayed he might find peace in God. Instead, he found it in creation. When he was 17, the struggle for the throne ended. Sophia was overthrown, and Peter, tall and restless, became Tsar in name, though not yet in power. His hands, large and scarred from work, were those of a craftsman more than a king. He dressed plainly, walked among common soldiers, and drank with sailors. In the shipyards of the Moscow suburb of Voronezh, Peter found his true kingdom, the art of the sea. Russia, landlocked for centuries, feared the ocean as much as it revered it. The Orthodox Church called it the realm of chaos. But Peter saw something else: freedom. In the curve of a mast, in the groan of timber under wind, he saw destiny. Russia, he declared, must have a window to the world. He built that window with fire and iron. His dream of access to the sea would drag the empire into wars it could scarcely afford, but his vision was relentless. He studied shipbuilding under Dutch craftsmen, incognito in European docks. Witnesses described him working shoulder to shoulder with carpenters, hands blistered, face smeared with sawdust, laughing as though born for labor. When he returned, his Russia was no longer the one his forefathers ruled. The boy who had once hidden from rebels had become a man who feared nothing, not tradition, not foreign powers, not even God's disapproval. He cut the beards of the boyars, ordered Western dress, founded schools of navigation and science. The old clergy called him an antichrist. His supporters called him a savior. Beneath his reforms, something ancient still pulsed: the duality of Russia itself, East and West, mystic and modern. Peter did not seek to destroy the old faith, only to outgrow it. But the more he built, the more fragile the balance became. In 1703, standing at the edge of the Baltic marshes, Peter drove his staff into the ground and declared the birth of a city, Saint Petersburg. "Here," he said, "shall stand the gateway to Europe." His companions shivered in the freezing rain, but Peter only smiled. Around him rose a city of bones built by serfs who died by the thousands in the swamps. The soil drank their sweat and blood alike. And yet from that suffering, beauty was born, a new Rome for a new age. The Romanov fire that had begun as a flicker in Mikhail's trembling hands now burned as an inferno in Peter's eyes. The boy of war had become the architect of an empire. But fire, even divine fire, consumes what it creates. And the empire he forged would one day burn again. Peter's dream of the sea. It begins with wind. Cold, relentless Baltic wind, sweeping over black water and newly raised scaffolds. Men work knee-deep in mud, hammering timbers into the marsh. The air smells of pine and salt and of sweat and blood. They curse in Russian, Swedish, German, an empire of tongues building one man's dream. Over them looms Peter, not the distant figure of a monarch, but a presence among them. His boots are soaked, his sleeves rolled, his eyes alive with that feverish gleam that both terrified and inspired those around him. Faster, he roars over the din. The Neva does not wait for kings. St. Petersburg was not born, it was wrenched from the earth. Founded in 1703 amid the Great Northern War, it was Peter's obsession, a city to open Russia to the west, to light the frozen heart of the empire with European fire. But to build it, men died by the thousands. The swamp claimed them silently. "We buried them right in the walls," one worker would later write, "so the city would stand upon our bones." Peter called it his paradise. His critics called it a graveyard. The dream of Saint Petersburg was not merely aesthetic, it was strategic. The Baltic was the key to trade, to influence, to recognition. For centuries, Russia had been landlocked, its culture turned inward, insulated by faith and frost. Peter would break that isolation with the force of a storm. In his youth, he had traveled to the west disguised as a commoner, the Grand Embassy, a voyage that transformed him. He worked in Dutch shipyards, studied anatomy in London, learned to chart stars and cannon trajectories alike. But what struck him most was not technology, it was the rhythm of progress. "They move," he wrote in a letter home, "while we still sleep." That, he swore, would change. Returning to Russia, Peter began a war not only against Sweden, but against time itself. He reorganized his army with brutal precision, drilled peasants into soldiers, and filled his navy with ships of his own design. The Tsar became both engineer and general, a force of will wrapped in human form. At Poltava, 1709, his dream was tested. The Swedish King Charles XII, proud and young, led one of Europe's most formidable armies. The snow was deep that June, the sky a silver haze. As cannons thundered, Peter stood amidst the smoke. Rallying his men, "Remember," he cried, "you fight not for me but for Russia's soul." The victory was absolute. Sweden's power shattered and the Baltic lay open. Europe, long disdainful of the barbarian East, was forced to reckon with a new force. Russia, vast, defiant, reborn, had stepped onto the stage of history. That night, as the fires of battle burned low, Peter walked among the wounded. He was silent. The snow melted red beneath his boots. One officer recorded him whispering, "Glory has no mercy." The victory made him emperor in all but name. But even as his empire expanded, his heart grew restless. Saint Petersburg rose, a city of canals and marble facades, where European architects drafted visions and Russian laborers fulfilled them with their lives. Every palace, every column, every gilded dome was a statement. Russia will no longer follow, it will lead. Yet for all its brilliance, the city felt alien to its own people. The old Moscow nobles, the boyars, muttered prayers against it. The Orthodox clergy called it the city of pride. They said the Tsar had traded heaven for mirrors and glass. Peter did not listen. "They call me mad," he said, "because I dream awake." But the dream came at a cost, not just in bodies, but in spirit. Russia's old soul, steeped in mysticism and humility, found itself stripped and redressed in foreign cloth. Beards were cut, sleeves shortened, prayers shortened too. The Tsar's decrees reached even into the homes of peasants, how they must dress, how they must think, how they must live. Peter's Russia was not a homeland, it was a project. And behind the thunder of progress, a quiet truth began to form. That the empire's greatest achievement was also its first fracture. The price of progress. The Neva River gleamed beneath the gray dawn like a blade drawn from the fog. Along its banks, St. Petersburg rose, spires and domes piercing the mist, reflections trembling on the surface of water and time. It was Peter's triumph, a city of stone built on willpower alone, carved into being from wilderness. Yet every triumph, he knew, demanded tribute. The empire's transformation had cost Russia more than its gold or blood, it had cost its soul. Inside the Winter Palace, the air shimmered with heat from 100 candles. Courtiers whispered in French, powdered wigs glistening beneath chandeliers imported from Vienna. The old Russian boyars sat stiffly in their Western clothes, their eyes burning with resentment. Once, they had ruled through birthright and faith. Now, they bowed to a Tsar who scorned their customs and rewrote their world. Peter strode among them like a man both admired and feared, tall, broad-shouldered, his eyes sharp as ice. He laughed loudly, drank deeply, and demanded loyalty with the same ferocity he demanded progress. His hands, the same hands that had built ships and drafted blueprints, could just as easily crush a goblet or a man's career. "Let them call me tyrant," he once told his confidant Menshikov. "A tyrant may build a nation, but a coward never will." His vision stretched beyond generations. He founded academies of science, modernized the army, created a civil service to replace the old feudal order. He even reformed the church, abolishing the patriarchate and placing the clergy under state control. The divine would now serve the empire. Yet for all his reforms, Peter remained a creature of contradictions, both enlightened and merciless. He could dissect a corpse in the morning and order an execution by noon. He spoke the language of reason, but ruled through fear. His reforms made Russia formidable, but his methods scarred it. The common people, the peasants, the soldiers, the builders who froze in the swamps of the Neva saw none of the splendor. Their hands shaped palaces they would never enter. Their sons were conscripted for wars they could not understand. In their prayers, Peter was not the great, but the terrible. Letters from the time tell of mothers following army recruiters through the snow, begging to keep their children. One writes, "They take them young, and they return with eyes that no longer see." And yet Peter pressed on. He believed in destiny, not comfort. To him, Russia was a child, unruly, brilliant, in need of discipline, and he, its father, would spare no rod. In 1718, that belief was tested in the most tragic way. His son, Tsarevich Alexei, refused to follow in his father's steps. Alexei longed for the old Russia, for faith, not fleets, for quiet, not conquest. He fled abroad, seeking refuge among those Peter called enemies. When the boy was captured and brought back, the Tsar's fury was cold and boundless. In a vaulted chamber lit only by torches, Peter interrogated his own son. Witnesses described a silence so heavy it seemed to bend the air. "You would undo all I have built," Peter whispered. "Then you are not my son." Days later, Alexei was found dead, officially of illness, though the truth was whispered differently. Peter attended the funeral without tears. "The state," he said, "is greater than blood." That night the wind howled across the Neva, rattling the windows of the unfinished city. Some said they saw the Tsar pacing the shore until dawn, his face pale, his eyes hollow. For once, the man who had conquered seas could not master the storm within himself. From that moment, Saint Petersburg ceased to be a dream. It became a monument not to victory, but to the price of it. And though Peter would rule for 7 more years, something in him died with his son. When he passed in 1725, the city he'd built stood proud and silent, its canals glinting like veins of glass beneath the snow. The people mourned, but they also whispered, "The fire has burned too hot." The empire was vast now, stronger, richer, feared. But beneath the grandeur lay something unspoken, the shadow of sacrifice. The age of Peter had ended, yet his echo would shape every Romanov to come, for better and for ruin. The echo of a giant. The death of Peter the Great did not bring silence. It brought a kind of trembling stillness, like the air after thunder. The empire he had built seemed almost uncertain of itself without the hand that had shaped it. The streets of St. Petersburg lay shrouded in mist that winter, the river frozen beneath the weight of grief and awe. People spoke of him in whispers, as though he might still be listening. In the cathedral where his body lay, the candles flickered low. Nobles and soldiers knelt before his coffin, some weeping, others merely watching, as if to confirm that such a man could, in fact, die. He had been both creator and destroyer, godlike and human all at once. In the end, he left behind no clear heir, only an unfinished empire and the question that haunted every dynasty: who can inherit the will of a giant? Catherine I, his wife and former servant, was crowned empress, the first woman to rule Russia. She ruled not by decree but by the memory of his power. The court adored her, Yet all knew she was merely a bridge between two storms. She kept Peter's policies alive, but her strength waned quickly. Within 2 years, she too was gone. The crown passed like a torch in a tempest to children, to favorites, to generals. For decades, the throne of Russia became a stage for ambition. Bloodlines twisted through intrigue and betrayal. Assassinations were whispered behind silk curtains. The empire Peter had welded together now shimmered with uncertainty, its brilliance shadowed by decay. But even as politics faltered, his legacy endured. His reforms had changed not only the machinery of power but the very imagination of Russia. No longer a realm turned inward, it now gazed toward the horizon. The ports thrived. The navy ruled the Baltic. Young nobles, educated in Western ways, returned with new languages, new philosophies, new doubts. In candle-lit salons, they debated reason and monarchy, quoting Voltaire and Locke. The air of Saint Petersburg buzzed with modernity, and with it, an unease. For every mind opened by progress, another longed for the certainties of old faith. The empire was no longer one voice but many, speaking in harmony and discord alike. Through the halls of the Winter Palace walked ghosts, Peter's presence still palpable. His portraits hung in every chamber, his statues rising in every square. The bronze figure that would one day be called the Bronze Horseman, arm outstretched, horse rearing above the city, seemed to watch over the empire like a living sentinel. To the people, he was both protector and warning. Poets began to write of him not as a man, but as a force of nature, a storm that could never truly die. Pushkin, more than a century later, would immortalize that spirit, the giant whose vision made Russia great and whose shadow darkened it forever. For the Romanovs who followed, Peter's legacy was both gift and curse. His empire demanded strength, his ideals demanded change, and his ghost demanded perfection. None could escape him. Every czar and czarina would measure themselves against the man who had dragged Russia into the light, and in doing so, had blinded it to its own past. By the mid-18th century, the empire stood vast and glittering, its armies feared, its culture envied. But beneath the marble and music, unrest whispered once again. The gap between the rulers and the ruled had grown wider than ever. And in that widening chasm, another figure began to rise, a woman who would match Peter's fire with her own brilliance. She would speak French but think in Russian. She would conquer not only lands but hearts, and she would leave her name inscribed beside his in the annals of empire. Her name was Catherine, and her age, the age of golden masks, was about to begin. The age of golden masks. The arrival of a German princess. The year was 1744, and the wind that swept through St. Petersburg carried with it both snow and expectation. The MP. Ray had grown vast under the ghosts of its past. Peter's city gleamed on the edge of the Baltic like a mirror turned toward Europe. But beneath the crystal and candlelight, the Romanov line wavered. The throne stood ready for a new heir, a new vision, a new fire to keep the empire's dream alive. Into this frozen world came a young woman from the small German principality of Anhalt-Zerbst. Her name was Sophie Friederike August. She was 17, sharp-eyed and ambitious in a way she dared not show. History would remember her by another name, Catherine the Great. The journey to Russia was long and cruel, the road littered with sleet and silence. Her carriage rattled through the endless forests, the air thick with frost. But within that carriage sat not a frightened girl, a strategist was being born. Sophie studied the language, the rituals, the temperament of her new homeland. "If I am to survive here," she wrote in her journal, "I must become more Russian than the Russians themselves." The capital awaited her like a stage lit by chandeliers. Empress Elizabeth, daughter of Peter the Great, welcomed her with smiles that masked suspicion. The court was a labyrinth of mirrors, flattery, gossip, and fear reflected endlessly. Beneath powdered wigs and velvet gowns, alliances shifted like shadows. Catherine learned quickly. She learned when to speak and when to listen, when to bow and when to charm. Her fiancé, Grand Duke Peter, Elizabeth's nephew, was everything she was not. Immature, erratic, obsessed with Prussian soldiers and toy armies. He paraded around his chambers in miniature uniforms, barking orders to servants forced to play the role of enemies. Catherine watched, silent, patient, enduring humiliation with a smile that never faltered. She found her refuge not in love but in knowledge. In the stillness of her room, she read Voltaire, Montesquieu, Diderot, Enlightenment thinkers who spoke of liberty, reason, and the perfect state. Their words became her private revolution. "I wish to make Russia happy," she once wrote, "but first I must make her mine." Years passed. The empress aged. The court whispered of succession. Catherine bore a son, the future Paul I, though even his parentage was questioned. Her husband grew crueler, mocking her in public, surrounding himself with flatterers. But Catherine endured. She played her part, the loyal consort, the pious mother. Yet beneath that facade, the mask of patience hardened into one of resolve. Then in December 1761, Empress Elizabeth died. Peter ascended the throne as Peter III, and chaos followed. He withdrew from wars that had bathed Russia in victory, insulted the army, alienated the church, and praised Frederick of Prussia, the empire's enemy. Within months, his popularity disintegrated. And Catherine, quiet, observant, waiting, saw her moment. In the early hours of July 9, 1762, Saint Petersburg awoke to the tolling of bells. Soldiers of the Imperial Guard swore allegiance not to the Tsar, but to his wife. Catherine, dressed in the green uniform of the Guards, rode out before them on a white horse, her sword gleaming in the dawn. The air crackled with destiny. "Brothers," she shouted, "the empire needs order, and I shall give it to you." The coup was swift. Peter fled, was captured, and days later found dead under mysterious circumstances. The new empress grieved in public, ruled in silence, and understood the crown was no longer a gift. It was a performance. That morning she stood at the window of the Winter Palace, the Neva glistening beneath her like liquid silver. She whispered to herself, "Now begins the true work." The girl from Germany had become the sovereign of Russia. The mask of survival had become the face of power. The empire of illumination. The throne room of the Winter Palace glittered like a sunrise frozen in glass. Golden walls reflected the light of 1,000 candles. Marble floors shimmered beneath silk shoes and jeweled hems. It was a theater of majesty, and at its center stood Catherine, poised, composed, radiant, and utterly alone. The orchestra played softly. The courtiers bowed, smiling with devotion and fear. She had survived her husband, seized the crown, and now wore it not as a burden, but as armor. Yet beneath the diamonds and titles, Catherine remained a woman of intellect. Her true kingdom lay not in conquests of land, but of the mind. She was determined to transform Russia from the backward colossus she had inherited into the enlightened empire she imagined. Her inspiration came from Europe's greatest philosophers. Voltaire called her the Star of the North and filled his letters with praise. Diderot journeyed to Saint Petersburg to meet her, astonished that an empress spoke his language of progress and reason. "You are not like the others," he told her. Catherine smiled. "Perhaps," she replied, "but I am still one of them." In her study, a quiet chamber lined with French books and icons alike, she wrote her nakaz, or instruction. It was a daring manifesto on law and governance, calling for equality before the law, the abolition of torture, and education for all. "A nation," she wrote, "should be governed not by fear but by reason." It was an idea centuries ahead of its soil. Outside the palace, Russia stretched endlessly, forests, plains, and villages frozen in another age. Most of its people were serfs, bound to the land and to their masters. The Enlightenment had reached the throne, but not the fields. Catherine's words glowed with light, but the shadows remained deep. Still, progress came. She modernized administration, expanded education, and encouraged the arts. Under her reign, St. Petersburg became the cultural capital of the East, its salons rivaling those of Paris, its theaters filled with music and debate. Painters, architects, and poets found patronage. The empire glittered again, its surface radiant with reason. But the more Catherine courted the light of Europe, the more she learned its hypocrisy. The philosophers who praised her for wisdom ignored the cost of her power. They admired her reforms but never asked about the lives buried beneath them. For every academy she built, a peasant village still burned in tax revolt. For every law she wrote, a nobleman found new ways to break it. The empire, vast and restless, could not be governed by words alone. Catherine's reign became a dance between ideals and necessity. Reason and ruthlessness entwined like lovers who could never part. When Pugachev's rebellion erupted in 1773, a massive uprising of peasants and Cossacks led by a man claiming to be her murdered husband, Catherine faced the dark reflection of her rule. The rebellion swept across the steppes like wildfire. Villages rose, nobles were slaughtered, and the air filled with smoke and vengeance. Catherine's response was swift and merciless. She unleashed her armies, crushed the revolt, and executed its leader publicly in Moscow. Mercy, she told her advisors afterward, is a luxury for peace, not for chaos. The Enlightenment had met the Russian frontier, and it had lost. Afterward, Catherine retreated deeper into the comfort of her court, hosting philosophers and musicians, while her empire continued to expand by sword and treaty alike. Crimea was annexed, new cities founded, maps redrawn. Russia had never been greater or more fragile. And though she shone as an empress of intellect, Catherine knew the truth whispered behind her back, that her crown rested not on wisdom but on fear. Still, she wore it with grace, for in her heart burned a conviction as cold as steel that destiny, once taken by force, must be defended the same way. The age of enlightenment had come to Russia. But in the flicker of candlelight, one could already see the shadow of revolution. Mirrors and masks. Evening in Saint Petersburg, the city glittered like a crown of frost. The canals gleamed with lantern light, and from the Winter Palace came the soft hum of violins, laughter, and the clink of crystal. It was an empire intoxicated by its own reflection. Catherine's court was the most dazzling in Europe, yet beneath its beauty, something trembled. The empress, now in her later years, sat before a mirror of Venetian glass. Her face, still regal, bore the quiet fatigue of one who had conquered everything except time. Servants adjusted her gown. Courtiers waited beyond the gilded doors. Tonight was a masquerade, another illusion of harmony in a realm stitched together by ambition. When the music began, the ballroom came alive, a storm of color and movement. Masks of gold and silver shimmered under candlelight. Laughter echoed through the halls, bright and hollow. Catherine moved among her guests with practiced ease, her smile a weapon honed by decades of rule. To the poets and philosophers who bowed before her, she was the embodiment of enlightenment. To her generals and ministers, she was the unshakable center of power. But Catherine knew better. She had built her empire not only on intellect but on manipulation, an endless dance of loyalty and betrayal. She had outlived lovers, rivals, and plots. Every friendship was political, every affection a performance. Even love was a matter of state. Behind her charm lay calculation. Her letters to Voltaire still carried wit and passion, but they were written as much for the world's admiration as for his. Her correspondence with Diderot turned from philosophy to policy. She was the empress who quoted Rousseau and silenced dissenters, the woman who championed freedom of thought, yet exiled writers who dared think freely about her. For Catherine understood the truth that Peter once learned in blood: ideals without control are chaos. To preserve her enlightened empire, she cloaked it in masks of progress, of grandeur, of peace. The masquerade that night stretched long into dawn. Beneath the chandeliers, nobles danced in circles, unaware history itself was turning with them. Beyond the palace gates, snow fell quietly upon a world far removed from the music, peasants in tattered coats, soldiers marching toward distant borders, mothers burying sons who had died for conquests they could not name. To them, the empress was a distant star, brilliant, unreachable, eternal. They would never see her hands tremble when the guests departed, or the tears she wiped away before facing her council at dawn. She ruled for more than 30 years, longer than most empires hold their breath. Under her command, Russia became a colossus, vast, glittering, and unyielding. But like all great creations, it bore the flaw of its maker. Catherine's Russia was not a nation united, but a reflection fractured into brilliance and darkness. In her final years, she began to fear the very ideas she had once embraced. The French Revolution erupted across Europe, kings dethroned, nobles executed, ideals turned to guillotines. She watched in horror as enlightenment became anarchy. "Liberty," she said bitterly, "is beautiful only in books." In 1796, the Empress rose before dawn as she always did, dictating letters, signing decrees, writing in her neat, precise hand. Hours later, she collapsed in her study, her pen falling beside a half-written word. When her body was laid in state, the halls of the palace were silent. Courtiers wept publicly, servants whispered privately. The mirror that had so long reflected her brilliance now reflected only emptiness. Outside, the city she had ruled still glittered, but the snow fell heavier that year, muffling every sound, as if the empire itself had paused to listen for her voice. She had worn many faces, lover, philosopher, ruler, conqueror, but in the end, all that remained was the silence of her absence. And in that silence, the empire waited. For the next ruler, for the next illusion. The golden masks had cracked, and through their fractures, the shadow of revolution crept closer. The shadows of revolution. The cracks beneath the marble. Winter had come again to Saint Petersburg. The Neva lay frozen, the city muffled in snow and silence. From the towers of the Admiralty, bells tolled for a new century. Yet beneath the chime of progress, something darker stirred. The empire of Catherine was gone, its grandeur lingering like perfume in an empty room. Her son, Paul I, now sat upon the throne, a man haunted by the shadow of his mother and the weight of her brilliance. Where she had ruled with grace and cunning, Paul ruled with suspicion and fear. He reversed her reforms, punished her allies, and surrounded himself with guards who feared him as much as they obeyed him. In the winter of 1801, that fear turned inward. As snow fell quietly over the capital, a group of officers entered the Mikhailovsky castle. The candles inside flickered against the cold. Within hours, Paul was dead, strangled by his own men. The murder was hushed. The dawn proclaimed natural causes. But all Russia knew the truth. The Romanov bloodline, sanctified by centuries, had spilled upon its own marble floors. And so began the uneasy reign of his son. Alexander I, young, idealistic, and deeply conflicted, Alexander inherited a crown tarnished by guilt. He dreamed of reform, of bridging the world his grandmother had built and the freedom that whispered across Europe. "I wish to serve both God and man," he told his tutor, "but perhaps neither will forgive me." In those days, the world itself seemed to shift. Beyond Russia's borders, Napoleon Bonaparte had risen from the ashes of revolution, a soldier turned emperor, his ambition consuming continents. Alexander, captivated and repelled by him, called him both the genius of war and the disease of Europe. In 1812, the disease came for Russia. Napoleon's Grand Armée, 600,000 men, marched across the border like a moving storm. They came in perfect ranks, banners snapping against the wind, the drums of empire echoing through endless plains. The Russians retreated, burning their own villages to deny the invaders food or shelter. Smoke rose from fields and forests alike, blackening the sky. As the French advanced, the land itself became an enemy. Rivers froze, horses starved. The endless winter, loyal only to Russia, began its quiet assault. When Napoleon entered Moscow, he found it empty. The city, the ancient heart of the empire, had been abandoned and set aflame by its own people. The glow of its destruction lit the horizon for days, a burning cross of defiance. Standing among the ruins, Napoleon whispered, "The world has lost its soul." By the time he retreated, his army was no longer an army, but a graveyard in motion. Men froze where they stood. Horses collapsed and were buried in snow. Of the 600,000 who entered Russia, fewer than 100,000 limped home. From the ashes of invasion, Alexander emerged a hero, the savior of Europe. In 1814, he rode into Paris. At the head of the victorious coalition, his soldiers singing hymns of deliverance. Yet behind his triumph lay exhaustion. The war had not saved his soul, it had broken it. In the years that followed, the emperor who once dreamed of freedom turned inward, seeking solace in mysticism and faith. He founded the Holy Alliance, vowing to rule through Christian virtue. But virtue could not silence discontent. The nobility murmured of reform, the army whispered of revolt. When Alexander died in 1825, in a distant southern town, some said of fever, others of despair, rumors spread that he had faked his death to become a wandering monk, repenting for the sins of empire. At his funeral, the people bowed in silence. Yet among the soldiers and officers, a new idea was taking shape, that the future of Russia could not be forged by divine right, but by the will of men. And in that belief lay the first tremor of the storm to come. The uprising of silence. The snow fell thick over Senate Square in Saint Petersburg that December morning of 1825. The city was still draped in mourning for the late Tsar Alexander I, its bells tolling a requiem that carried through the icy air. Yet beneath that solemn sound, another rhythm began to rise, the murmur of defiance. Hundreds of soldiers stood in formation, their boots frozen to the ground, their breath pluming like smoke. They were young, idealistic, and afraid, though none dared admit it. They called themselves Decembrists, officers and nobles who had fought in the Napoleonic Wars and returned home with ideas too dangerous for the empire: liberty, law, constitution. They had seen Europe's revolutions and wondered why Russia still bowed to a crown untouched by accountability. Their goal was not chaos, it was conscience. They wanted a constitutional monarchy, an empire of reason, not fear. But fate once again had other plans. When Alexander died without a clear heir, confusion engulfed the capital. His brother Constantine had renounced the throne, leaving the younger Nicholas to ascend. On the day of Nicholas's oath-taking, the Decembrists made their stand not to crown a man, but to crown an idea. The scene was almost biblical in its cold simplicity. The frozen square, the gray sky, the silent crowd. Officers raised their voices. "Long live Constantine! Long live the Constitution!" Words that some soldiers, illiterate and bewildered, thought referred to Constantine's wife, a mysterious woman named Constitution. Nicholas, watching from the palace, trembled not with fear but with outrage. He was young, newly crowned, and determined never to appear weak. As the hours dragged on and the rebels refused to disperse, he gave the order that would define his reign. The cannons roared. The blast tore through the still air, echoing down the frozen river. Men fell. The snow turned red. The Decembrist revolt, Russia's first modern uprising, was crushed before dusk. Survivors were hanged or sent to Siberia, their ideals buried beneath the same frost that had witnessed them rise. When the smoke cleared, Nicholas I stood alone on the balcony of the palace, watching his soldiers drag the dead away. "I have defended the throne," he said quietly, "but against whom? My own heart." The next 3 decades became known as the Iron Reign. Nicholas ruled with discipline, order, and unyielding control. The empire became a fortress of obedience, every word censored, every whisper weighed. Spies filled the streets. Universities were muzzled. The people learned to speak in half-sentences, to think behind their eyes. Yet the silence he enforced only deepened the rumble beneath. Russia expanded, industrialized, and educated its youth, and in that education lay seeds he could not suppress. Writers like Pushkin, Lermontov, and Gogol filled the void with words too beautiful to be harmless. Their verses spoke of souls imprisoned by duty, of love and loss, of the quiet agony of being Russian under the weight of eternity. Pushkin himself, the voice of a generation, died in a duel, a bullet through his heart, a metaphor through the nation. Nicholas wept for him publicly and censored him privately. Even the Tsar, it seemed, feared the power of words. In the shadows of such control, new ideas festered: socialism, nationalism, revolution, whispered in taverns, printed in secret, carried in the hearts of dreamers. The empire glittered with victory parades and processions, but beneath the marble and brass, something human and unstoppable pulsed. By the time Nicholas died in 1855, Russia stood at a crossroads once again. The Crimean War had exposed its weakness. The myth of invincibility was gone. His last words, murmured to a priest at his bedside, were said to be, "Now they will see what it costs to rule Russia." And they did. For his son, Alexander II, would inherit not just the crown, but the weight of every silence his father had imposed. And the silence was ready to break. The Tsar who freed and fell. The dawn of March 1855 broke cold and gray over the empire. Nicholas I was dead, and the throne passed to his son Alexander II, a man whose eyes carried neither the iron of his father nor the brilliance of his forebears, but a deep, searching weariness. The empire he inherited was wounded. The Crimean War had bled it dry. Its armies, once feared, lay humiliated. The factories were few, the roads fewer still. Russia, for all its size, was a giant chained to its own past. Alexander looked upon his father's empire disciplined, obedient, suffocating, and whispered a quiet vow: better to abolish serfdom from above than wait for it to abolish itself from below. For centuries, Russian peasants had lived bound to the land, traded and taxed like cattle. Their sweat built the palaces, their backs carried the empire's pride. But the age of faith had given way to the age of reason, and the weight of injustice could no longer be sanctified by ritual. The Emancipation Edict of 1861 came like thunder through the countryside. It was read aloud in village squares, its words trembling on the lips of priests and governors. By the grace of God, we grant freedom to all serfs. Bells rang across Russia. Peasants wept, knelt, and crossed themselves. But freedom, like winter sunlight, gave little warmth. The newly freed peasants found themselves landless, burdened by redemption payments they could never afford. They were no longer slaves, but neither were they free. Fields lay empty, villages starved, and in the city streets the dream of reform curdled into anger. Still, Alexander pressed forward. He reformed the courts, the army, the education system. He opened the doors of government to new voices, new minds. For the first time in centuries, hope seemed to breathe in Russian air. The newspapers called him Tsar Liberator. Students spoke his name with reverence. Yet for every measure of progress there was resistance. The nobility grumbled, fearing the loss of privilege. The radicals whispered, demanding more than gradual change. The empire, vast and divided, began to tremble beneath the strain of its own awakening. And still the Tsar believed. He met with thinkers, debated with reformers, walked among the people in disguise. He dreamed of a Russia enlightened, just modern. But the deeper he reached for compassion, the more fiercely the darkness clung. By the 1870s, revolution had ceased to be an idea and become a movement. Secret societies formed, Narodnaya Volia, the people's will, their members young, educated, idealistic. They loved Russia so much they were willing to kill for her. Assassination attempts became the new language of rebellion. Bombs hidden beneath coats, pistols in theater aisles, dynamite planted on rail lines. Each failure only deepened their resolve, and in every letter confiscated by police, one name repeated: Alexander. On a frigid Sunday in March 1881, the Tsar rode through St. Petersburg in his open carriage. The streets were quiet, snow drifted across the cobblestones. A young man stepped forward and threw a bomb beneath the horses. The explosion tore through the air, shattering windows for blocks. Guards rushed forward. The Tsar, miraculously unhurt, stepped from the wreckage to aid the wounded. Then came the second bomb. The blast struck him directly, his legs torn away, his chest mangled. Blood stained the snow where once his reforms had been written in ink. As he was carried back to the Winter Palace, the streets fell silent. He died minutes later, whispering prayers for a nation that could not forgive its savior. Outside, the snow continued to fall soft, endless, indifferent. In the square where his body was later entombed, they built the Church of the Savior on spilled blood, its gilded domes rising like tears frozen in gold. It stood as both monument and warning, that in Russia, even mercy could end in violence. His death marked the end of an age, the last moment when hope and monarchy still dared to coexist. What followed would be an empire ruled by suspicion, by fear, by shadows long and cold. For his son, Alexander III, would rule not as a reformer, but as a fortress. And behind his iron reign, a boy named Nicholas would grow, quiet, gentle, unready, the last Tsar, born into a world already cracking beneath its own weight. The last Tsar. The final winter of the Romanovs began like any other, cold, splendid, and deceivingly calm. Snow covered the palaces of St. Petersburg like a veil over a corpse not yet buried. The empire still glittered in its rituals, its parades, its prayers, but the light had grown brittle. In the heart of this fading grandeur sat a man both devoted and doomed, Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia. He was not cruel, not ambitious, not even particularly proud. He was, above all, sincere, and that was his tragedy. Born into opulence, educated in obedience, Nicholas saw himself as a servant of God, chosen to guide Russia as his forefathers had. Yet the world he inherited was no longer one of thrones and decrees. It was a world of factories, of workers, of restless minds that could no longer be silenced by prayers. His coronation in 1896 was meant to mark a rebirth. Instead, it began with death. At Kodinka Field, where hundreds of thousands gathered for the celebration, the crowd surged toward the gifts and food prepared for the people. In the chaos, over 1,000 were crushed. The fields ran red beneath the banners of joy. Nicholas wept in private, but that night, urged by courtiers, he attended a ball in his honor. The newspapers would never forget it. From that day, he was Nicholas the Bloody, not by cruelty, but by fate. His reign unfolded in the age of change he could neither grasp nor halt. Railways carved through frozen lands. Cities swelled with factories, their chimneys coughing black clouds into the pale sky. A new class of workers emerged, nameless, tireless, angry. Beneath the gold of the empire, iron ground against bone. The Tsar's wife, Alexandra, was his opposite, strong-willed, emotional, and consumed by faith. A granddaughter of Queen Victoria, she brought to Russia the manners of Europe and the mysticism of desperation. She bore Nicholas 4 daughters and at last a son, the long-awaited heir, Alexei. But the boy was ill. Hemophilia, the hidden curse of royal blood, made every bruise a threat of death. From that wound came a name whispered like a prayer, Rasputin. He arrived at court a peasant mystic, unkempt, hypnotic, his eyes said to hold both heaven and madness. To Alexandra he was salvation, to Nicholas an embarrassment, to the nobility a serpent. Yet when the boy bled and the doctors failed, Rasputin would pray and the bleeding stopped. In gratitude, the empress clung to him, blind to his scandals, deaf to his enemies. Soon the empire spoke not of the Tsar, but of the monk who ruled him. Caricatures filled secret papers, the holy man in orgies, the empress in tears, the empire in shame. Rasputin's influence deepened even as his body decayed with excess. The more he sinned, the more Alexandra defended him. He is chosen, she insisted. He alone keeps our sun alive." Meanwhile, Russia's streets boiled, factories struck, soldiers murmured, bread grew scarce, hope scarcer still. In 1905, workers marched to the Winter Palace, carrying icons and portraits of the Tsar, begging for justice. They came not as rebels but as children to a father. The soldiers opened fire. When the gunfire ceased, the snow was red once more. Over 1,000 lay dead or dying. The event would be remembered as Bloody Sunday, and the bond between the Tsar and his people was broken forever. Nicholas tried to repair it. He signed reforms, created a parliament, the Duma, but each concession was followed by hesitation, each reform drowned in bureaucracy and distrust. He wanted to be loved. His people wanted to be heard. Between them stretched the gulf of centuries. And as the empire stumbled toward modernity, the shadows grew longer, reaching even into the royal nursery. The Tsar still prayed. The empress still wept. Rasputin still whispered. But outside the palace walls, a storm was forming, not of weather but of will. The people were no longer afraid to speak. And history, once silent, had begun to roar. The fall of the sun. By 1914, Russia was a sleeping giant with a fever. Its armies were vast, its people countless, but its spirit exhausted. The empire that had once terrified Europe now trembled under its own weight. When the Great War came, it was greeted not with dread but with delirium. Bells rang from every church. Crowds filled the streets waving icons and flags. For faith, Tsar, and fatherland. They shouted, unaware that this war would not save the empire, it would end it. Nicholas, bound by duty and pride, led his nation into the inferno. At first, victory seemed within reach, but the front stretched endlessly from the Baltic to the Black Sea, swallowing men like the sea swallows stones. The soldiers marched barefoot through snow, rifles shared between three, their hunger deeper than the trenches they dug. Letters from the front spoke of glory turned to mud. One soldier wrote, "We fight not the Germans, but the winter and the hunger in our own bellies." Back in Petrograd, the city renamed to sound less German, desperation grew. Bread lines coiled through streets. Mothers sold heirlooms for flour. Factories stood silent, their workers on strike. The empire's pulse slowed to a single rhythm, waiting, enduring, breaking. And at the center of it all, the Tsar remained blind. Nicholas left the capital to command his armies at the front, leaving behind Alexandra and through her, Rasputin. The mystic's influence grew monstrous in his absence. Ministers were dismissed at whim, policies shifted with each whispered vision. In the dark corridors of the palace, rumors multiplied like shadows, that Rasputin ruled the empire, that the empress was his lover, that treason wore a crown. By 1916, even those loyal to the throne began a plot against it. Princes, generals, statesmen, all agreed that Rasputin must die. And so one freezing night in December, they invited him to a palace under the pretense of friendship. They offered him wine laced with cyanide, cakes filled with poison. He ate, drank, and laughed and did not die. Panicked, they shot him. He fell, rose again, and fled into the courtyard before a final bullet found his heart. When they dragged his body beneath the ice of the Neva, the city exhaled as though released from a nightmare. But the relief was short-lived. Rasputin was gone. Yet his poison remained, not in veins, but in perception. The people no longer believed their Tsar ruled by divine right. They believed he ruled by deceit. The winter of 1917 arrived hard and unmerciful. Factories froze, trains stopped, soldiers deserted. In February, women marched in Petrograd, shouting for bread. The soldiers sent to disperse them joined them instead. Within days, the empire's capital belonged to its people. Nicholas, far away at the front, received the news in disbelief. He wired orders, prayed for loyalty, and found none. His generals begged him to abdicate to save his family, if not his crown. On March 15, 1917, aboard a train bound nowhere, Nicholas signed the paper that ended 3 centuries of Romanov rule. His words were simple: "May God's will be done." The empire had died with a whisper. The Tsar, once emperor of all the Russias, now traveled under guard with his family, a father with his wife, 4 daughters and a sickly son. They were sent first to Tobolsk, then to Yekaterinburg, each journey narrower, each horizon darker. Yet within their captivity there was strange grace. The family prayed together, sang hymns, tended gardens. Nicholas chopped wood each morning. The children sewed and wrote letters. "We are at peace," Alexandra wrote to a friend, "for we are together." But beyond the walls, the new world was awakening. Red banners replaced eagles. Lenin's words burned hotter than any fire the old empire could command. And the soldiers guarding the royal family no longer saluted, they only stared. The dawn of revolution had broken. And it would show no mercy for ghosts. The house falls silent. The spring of 1918 arrived late in the Ural Mountains, a hesitant season, gray and fragile. In Yekaterinburg, snow still clung to the rooftops of the merchant's house-turned-prison, known to the guards as the Ipatiev House. Its windows were shuttered, its walls bare. Inside, a dynasty waited for history to remember them. The Romanovs had been moved there under the orders of the new Bolshevik regime. For their safety, they were told. But everyone knew what that meant. The revolution had spread like fire, consuming palaces, monuments, and names once thought eternal. Across the countryside, noble estates burned. Priests were hanged in their own churches. Russia was devouring its past to feed its future. In that small, dim house, Nicholas still kept to his old routines. He rose early, shaved with a dull razor, and read scripture aloud to his children. He was no longer emperor, no longer master of a nation, only a father holding onto dignity as the world stripped him of everything else. Alexandra remained steadfast in her faith. She spent her days writing in her diary, praying for deliverance and nursing her frail son Alexei. Her handwriting, once elegant, trembled across the pages. God sees all. He will not abandon us. Perhaps we are to suffer for Russia, and that is his will. The daughters Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia filled the silence with songs, embroidery, whispered laughter. Their innocence clung to the air like the scent of candle wax. To the guards they were polite, almost ethereal, the family of ghosts. One soldier would later call them. But outside, the storm raged on. The Russian Civil War split the country between the Red Army and the White. Cities burned. Trains carried the wounded through a wasteland of mud and frost. In the distance, artillery thundered like the voice of judgment. The Bolsheviks feared that if the Whites captured Yekaterinburg, they might restore the Romanovs as a symbol of the old order. So in the secrecy of that fear, a decision was made. On the night of July 16, 1918, the guards were ordered to wake the family. The Tsar was told they would be moved again for safety. Sleepy and obedient, the Romanovs dressed quietly. Nicholas carried Alexei in his arms. The girls followed, clutching pillows that concealed jewels sewn into their seams, small remnants of a vanished world. They were led down a narrow staircase into a basement room. The walls were whitewashed. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling. Nicholas looked around, puzzled. "Is there no chair for my son?" he asked gently. One was brought. Then the commandant entered with a pap. In his hand. He read from it in a trembling voice. "Nikolai Alexandrovich, in view of the fact that your relatives have continued their attack on Soviet Russia, you are sentenced to death." The Tsar blinked, confused. "What?" he whispered. The shots followed. Gunfire erupted in the small room, deafening, chaotic. Smoke filled the air. The daughters screamed. Alexei cried out. Alexandra crossed herself. The bullets ricocheted off jewels hidden beneath their corsets, forcing the executioners to finish their work with bayonets. When it was done, silence returned, thick and absolute. The bodies were carried into the night, loaded onto a truck, and taken into the forest. There, in a shallow pit, the Romanovs, once rulers of 1/6 of the earth, were buried beneath lime and secrecy. For decades, the Soviet regime denied the crime. The house was demolished, the record sealed. But the silence could not last forever. In time, bones would be found, DNA tested, prayers whispered once more for those long lost. And yet beyond history, beyond politics, the image remains. A family standing together in a small, dim room facing eternity. The last Romanov crossed himself before the first bullet fell. And with him, the age of empires ended. The candle that had burned for 300 years flickered once and went out. The silence that followed was not emptiness, but echo. The echo of splendor and suffering, of belief and betrayal, of an empire that dreamed of eternity and found only time. Some say the Romanovs died that night, others say Russia did. And as snow fell over the Ural forests, covering the earth like a final benediction, the House of Romanov, the empire of splendor and shadows, was at last at peace.